Hey, I thought this would be fun. Uh, my mom wants a new computer, and I'm gonna build one for her, but I thought it would be interesting to try to record the build on video. I've never really done anything like this before, and I don't really have equipment for it. As you can see, I've kind of duct taped my cell phone onto my head, and you're gonna see a lot of very painful camera angles in this video because of how unprofessionally it was done. But, that said, I've just about unpacked everything that I bought for the build, so we're about to get into it. This is a relatively cheap build using low-cost components, low-cost case with a built-in power supply, brand new Kaby Lake Intel CPU i3. Just a basic build for a good computer that will hopefully last a long time, be usable for a long time, for basic use. Anyway, I've just attached the I/O shield, which is a chunk of metal that interfaces between the motherboard and the case. There's a standard shape and size for an I/O shield in a case, and they all seem to fit pretty well. They just have different holes drilled out for where the different I/O pieces on the motherboard are. And right there, I found that some of those springy pins that attach to the motherboard were bent in a little bit, and they were sticking inside the HDMI port, which is no good. You don't want those pins to get stuck inside one of the sockets or ports. So here I decided to try to put the I/O shield in the case first before trying to install the motherboard, because it's kind of springy and it has to snap into place correctly for the motherboard to fit properly. And eventually I got it where the motherboard mounting, they're called standoffs, they're like little sticky-uppy posts that you can put screws into. So I had to get those to line up correctly with the holes in the motherboard. And my first thought was, hey, I've got RAM, why don't I put the RAM in? So I could do that, but I realized it might be easier to do that later and make sure I had as much room as possible to put the CPU in first. Now, any experienced builder will tell you that this is wrong. You should actually put the CPU and the RAM onto the motherboard before you even put the motherboard in the case, and especially before you screw the motherboard into the standoffs in the case. But I don't do this for a living, I'm just a guy, so I did it wrong, and I don't think that it'll break or anything like that. It's just that it's, technically easier if you put the stuff in the motherboard first and then install the motherboard. So right here you'll see that I'm pointing out the little triangle on the lower left hand corner of the CPU has to match up with the little triangle on the lower left hand corner of the CPU socket. And that's something you gotta be careful with. Obviously, if you try to put it in wrong, you could break it, you could bend the pins, and it obviously won't work. So here, it fits into the CPU mount, and then you just have to press down pretty hard on that little spring-loaded lever to lock it into place and make sure that it's pressed down with enough force to ensure that the contacts will have a good electronic connection. Then the second step is to install the CPU heatsink and fan. This is just a stock heatsink from Intel. You can see there's 4 holes in the motherboard where those little expanding plastic pins will fit. And as a matter of fact, I did this wrong the first time. You might be able to see it on video as soon as my jerry-rigged camera can focus on it. But essentially, you simply have to push the pins in and they'll expand and lock into place so that they can't be pulled out anymore. But I tried to twist them according to the arrows that are printed on those little thumb tool things. Turns out those arrows are for taking it out rather than putting it in, and they'll release the pressure that's applied when you push the pins in and snap them into place. So I did that wrong. Later on I corrected it, but just something to note. All you have to do is snap them into place and push them in. If you read the manual, which I obviously didn't do, it'll say that on pretty much the first page. Anyway, now I'm installing the RAM. This is another thing that I did wrong the first time. I kinda snapped it into place. I saw that there's only one little lever that you can use to eject the RAM, and that has to be snapped in and clipped on to make the RAM stay snug and not move. The other side is just a blank wall that there's no snap on it. Well, turns out I didn't press down hard enough on the side that did not have a snap, and the first time I booted this machine, it beeped 3 times, which is secret code that you can look up if you look up ASRock motherboard beep codes or AMI BIOS beep codes. Depending on the BIOS version you have or the motherboard you have, it might be different. But for this motherboard, 3 beeps means either the RAM is broken, or the RAM is not plugged in, or the RAM is incompatible. So turns out it wasn't plugged in fully, and I had to eject it and fully press it in both on the left and the right side of the RAM stick. Anyway, now I'm trying to open up a clasp which will allow me to access the PCI Express expansion port area of the case. There are these little metal pieces there lining up with the PCI Express slots, and I need to remove those because I'm going to install a wireless card in one of those slots. I thought that I would remove the other one as well in case a graphics card needs to be installed at a later date. So these are just little chunks of metal that have been cut out from the rest of the case and are attached by a thin little slice of metal, and you can just pop them out with a screwdriver or whatever. Sometimes they're a little stubborn, but these gave way after a while, after a little bit of poking and prodding. So now it's time to install the wireless card. The first thing I noticed was that the expansion slot bracket that was on the wireless card was way too big. It was for a full-size case, and this is a thin case. Luckily, the wireless card comes with a mounting bracket for a thin case as well. I just had to unscrew the existing bracket and replace it with the smaller one. All I have to do now is snap it into place in the PCI Express slot and in the corresponding bolt that will fit in with the bracket on the expansion card flap thing there, and then lock the flap back into place. Normally there would just be a screw or a bolt involved in that, but this is a tool-free case that's supposed to allow you to install all your components without using a screwdriver if you want. Well, I guess except for screwing the motherboard in place. So now I'm looking at the 12-pin ATX power connector that comes out of the power supply and plugging it into the motherboard. A lot of these power connectors only connect one way, so it's pretty easy to find what connects to what just by putting them together and seeing if they fit. That's the power connector for the SSD, but I'm getting ahead of myself here because I don't even know where the SSD goes yet. So one thing I do know where it goes is the CD drive or DVD drive. It obviously slides into that little 5-inch drive bay that's right in the center and top of the case. So first I'm going to have to pop off that plastic front piece, and I had to take a break from recording to figure out exactly how that goes. But once you pop it off, you'll see that these drive bays covers are just held on by little plastic clips that will pop out if you push on them. So you can open up that bay and slide in whatever. The other smaller one could be used for a card reader or something similar like that. Anyway, let's try putting this CD drive in and see what happens. Again, it turns out that in most case designs you'd use screws to hold something like this in, but this case has little spring-loaded pins that will slide into the screw holes and hold the drive in place instead of screws. Now at this point, my phone started stopping and dying periodically and I wasn't sure why, so I cut the video a couple times. Eventually I figured out that the 5-inch drive bay for the CD drive can be detached entirely, and underneath it is where the 2.5-inch drive bay where the SSD would fit lives. So you can see that I popped it out and the SSD will fit in between those two metal brackets right there. Normally screws would be put here, but this piece has little metal pins instead of screws. So I had to bend the pins up a little bit to make them fit correctly. And then there's a whole assembly that slides into place and locks it underneath that 5-inch drive bay. I think this is the 3.5-inch bay. It's like a little plastic rotating thing. I never looked into that because I don't have a 3.5-inch drive, but that's where you could expand this with another hard drive if you wanted. Anyway, let's slide the CD drive back in, and my phone died again. But anyway, now that we've got the CD drive installed and the SSD installed, it's pretty much a game of connect the cables where they fit, make sure everything is connected, and make sure that none of the power cables are exposed where they could accidentally contact a metal piece inside the case. Because often your power supply will have more power cables than you need, and some of them can get caught on pins that stick out of the motherboard. I know someone who said that they fried their CPU that way, which was a very sad story. You don't want to have that happen. So I just placed duct tape over all those extra power cords and rubber banded them in place so that they won't move. And here's where my phone ran out of disk space and stopped recording permanently. But after this, there's not that much to show. It was pretty much a game of plug in the cable where it fits, combined with find where you have to plug in things for the case, like the power button, the power LED, They all have their own little plugs, and these are the only plugs that are difficult to figure out exactly where you go, and you have to read the schematic and look at it carefully. But after all those things were plugged in, it still didn't boot. Turns out that the CPU that I got was incompatible with the version of the BIOS that was shipped by default on that motherboard. So the BIOS on the motherboard had to be updated. But after that was done, it worked great. Booted up perfectly, installed Windows, ran really fast. So that's about it. Thanks for watching.